Hi, you're listening to Marcia Pally and conversations I'm having with people about the criteria we should use to design and implement our economic and political policies. What should be our basic framework for determining public policy? These conversations are based on ideas from a book of mine, Commonwealth and Covenant, Economics, Politics, and Theologies of Relationality, because we're looking specifically at relationality as this framework for policy. Relationality includes both the individual person and the relations and contexts that he or she is in. Relationality is developed in many of our philosophical traditions and also in several theological traditions. Whether you think theologies are the word of the divine or an illuminating metaphor, in both cases they offer us much about how the world and people work, and so about the policies that will lead to the greatest human flourishing. Please join us in this series of conversations. Commonwealth and Covenant was published by Erdman's Press in 2016. You can follow me at marciapally.com or search for me on Facebook and Twitter. So I'm going to talk first about the problems of too much separatedness or separability excessively. And I'm going to talk about it and the problems that it creates and how we know anything in the world, or epistemologically. Epistemologically, the science of how we come to know anything. Well, the problem with too much separatedness is that it posits or imagines the individual as the individual is not particularly in relation, not in relation to others, not in relation to the environment, and not particularly in relation to the undergrounding cause of whatever makes everything. Now the problem is that if we're so cut off from and separate, all the problems of skepticism arise. How do we know? How do I know you're there? How do I know you're out there? How do I know anything is out there? How do you know I'm here, etc., etc.? The foundation for our knowing about the world that we're in and about each other crumbles. The premise of our ability to know each other or anything about the world becomes highly problematic because, well, it could be a dream, or it could be a hallucination, or it could be just the internal movie that your mind is running with little contact to what is really out there. This is, of course, the problem that many of Immanuel Kant's critics brought up in regards to his philosophy of the internal mind developing its transcendental categories, its categories of ways of seeing the world, but we can never be sure that the world out there is the world that we see inside our minds. Then how is it that we function? And this is indeed a very lonely way to look at the world. Charles Taylor called this way of looking at the world the immanent frame, a look at the world immanently with a loss of connection to others, to the environment, and to whatever it is that is structuring existence at all. And while this got a loud microphone in the Western philosophy from Descartes to Kant, as I mentioned, it has the problems of hermetically sealing people off and raising the unending issues of skepticism. How do you know that you know anything if you have no foundational access to each other, to the world, and to whatever makes things exist? With a focus on the immanent frame in early modernity, on this world, This is a picture of the world as independent of a larger order and unaffected by anything other than its own natural laws, which humanity, with reason and science, can control. It's the idea, as David Bentley Hart jokes, physics explains everything, which we know because anything physics cannot explain doesn't exist, which we know because whatever exists must be explicable by physics, which we know because physics explains everything. Yeah? It's a circular way of reasoning. Everything that exists is explainable by physics because physics explains everything. Right? And this is a very good, if funny, description of the immanent frame, which had the result of disconnecting the human mind from its environment. Overlooked in this, of course, is the obvious point that existence itself, for example, that there is nature at all. Why should anything exist? Why should there be nature? Nature cannot be explained from inside the laws of nature, like physics. Physics are the laws of nature. From the laws that govern how nature works, for it's exactly the laws of nature that need to be explained. Yeah? Physics is marvelous. Why does physics work the way it does? That's what needs to be explained. So you can't explain the why we have physics from inside physics. That's the problem with the immanent frame, with thinking that everything is explainable from within inside the material, physical, immanent world. Three things followed from the focus on the immanent frame in early modernity. We're talking the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Our sense of interdependence with world and its source, whatever makes anything, diminished. Our sense of interdependence diminished and was replaced by a sense of autonomy and lordship over the world and lordship over nature. Second, we developed an increased focus, an increased time, energy, and creativity went on observable events that we can test and change as we like, and the mistaken idea that that's all of existence. That's again like saying that everything that exists is explainable by physics because physics explains everything. And the third thing is that the Western early moderns developed an inflated sense of self-sufficiency and awe for the inside of our minds that can master the external world. Now look at the words I've used. We've got the inside of our minds and the external world, right? And we are going to know it, a subject-object distinction, and we are going to come master it, having forgotten that we are in it and we are of the world that we are in. We are made of the stuff that makes the world, and whatever is the reason for the world is also the reason for us. We are not observing the world from an outside perch. But from this early modern sense of self-sufficiency came the possibility of disengagement, or again, as Paul Tillich writes, the synthesis between individuality and participation was dissolved. Between individuality and participation in the world, what we're calling separability and situatedness was dissolved by this focus on the immanent frame. It was dissolved, both the Catholic Charles Taylor and the Protestant Tillich note, not only by this discussion of early modernity, but inadvertently by certain forms of Protestantism. Taylor writes that in reconceptualizing the sacred from a defined area of the church to the world at large, the Reformation succeeded in sacralizing the world, making the world at large sacred, but unseated our sense of a divine order. God, sacred church, mundane world. What remained was less faith in cosmic ordering, which left humanity, the world, to be humanity's responsibility, left to humanity to run and to structure. Tillich's focus on Protestantism's emphasis on the individual's relationship with God. Now I'm moving, that was Charles Taylor, I'm moving from the Protestant to the Protestant Paul Tillich, who noticed that the immanent frame was boosted, again inadvertently, by Protestantism's emphasis on the individual's relationship with God, her obligation to come to such relationship with God regardless of worldly situation, regardless of the, quote, relativities and ambiguities of the human condition which might weaken individual moral obligation. Each person, using reason, was to rise above the temptations of her situation, such that, and now I'm quoting Tillich, man became more and more transformed into an abstract moral subject, close quote, because each person becomes morally obligated to separate from the contingencies and the situations of one's life in order to achieve the very laudable goal of developing a moral life and closeness to God. This is a paradox of Protestantism. The limitations of the immanent frame and of looking at the world as an outside sub-object and our minds as the inside of our head were noticed in the middle of the 18th century, while Kant was still writing and still being the most sophisticated proponent of the picture that we have. We know the inside of our minds, we know our categories of perception, but we don't know if they are the real world. His friend and critic, Johann Georg Hamann, was one of his earliest critics, Kant's earliest critics. And he noticed that this Kantian break in the connection between your mind and the world has the following problems. First, it's completely mystical, much more mystical than the most mystical religion, because it posits the world as noumena, as Kant called them, objects out there that you never really have contact with because you are always filtering them through your mind, and there's never anything of the reason for being that you have contact with. Now, I want to underscore what I just said. We've been describing the individual, yeah, as having something of the reason for all being in metaphorically ourselves to exist at all. But that would then suggest that we have some access to the reason for being because it's metaphorically in us, constructing us. And since the reason for being is in others as well, that we have some access to each other. But the Kantian and Cartesian vision is that there's a break in that connection. There is no actual contact. You have the movie running in your head of whatever you think the world is, but you don't have real contact either with the reason for everything existing or for that reason as it is expressed in other people or other things. So this way of looking at the world posits a break in connection in exactly the way we were describing that we all exist, with something of the ground for all existence metaphorically, in us. And this is a break with that. Kant suggested that we have sense impressions that affect our mental apparatus, and from these raw sense impressions, so to speak, the categories of our mind make what we call an understanding of the world, knowledge, explanations for the way things are. And that moment of sense impression was Kant's only granting that the outside world comes and influences us, and with these sense impressions, then our mind constructs the whole movie. But the problem with that is, how do we know that sense impressions come and influence the mind? because in Kant's view, we have only our internal movie. How do we know those sense impressions are really coming from the outside world and are not coming from our own internal movie? So Kant's first premise, that sense impressions come from the outside world and onto our mental categories, is itself questionable as one of our mental categories. How do we know? So if you buy into the Kantian view, this, as I said, this separated view, the one that opposes the view that we have something of the ground for everything in us and there have access to it and to everything else in the world. If you buy into Kant's oppositional view, then you have no choice but to doubt his first premise, that sense impressions influence the categories of the mind. What did Johann Georg Hamann suggest in counter Kant? He said, this is nonsense. He replaces this separated mind with the situated mind. The mind that has something of the source of all existence in it, against in metaphorically, and therefore has access to everything else that has the source of existence in it, all access to things and other people. And he said, therefore, that our ideas, our words, our language, our images, our symbols, all the things that the mind produces, they're not only an internally running movie that has little access to the world, but rather they're real, they're in the world too. They're just as real as turtles and lollipops and benzene and Coca-Cola. They're in the world. They're things in the world as well. And they also have whatever is that makes everything in them. It's a fluid system rather than a separated system. There are real things in the world. Your mind is in the world. And all the products of your mind, your ideas, your symbols, your words, your metaphors, your dreams, your imagination, they're in the world as well. And all of that is grounded by whatever makes anything. That the products of your mind are part of the world as well. I want to add one caveat or warning here. This means, of course, that, as Hamann said, groups and subgroups and sub-subgroups and individuals will have a slightly different interpretation of the world because separability, no one is in it the same way. And so we will have different impressions of the world. But this is not because we are locked into our own home screening of our own home movie. It's because the different impressions that we all have of the world, including cultural differences, they're real. Everybody really does have a different perspective, right? The perspective that I have looking at you this way is really different from if you're on the other end of this table looking this way. That's not in your imagination. That's real. That's part of the world. And it's part of whatever made the world to be the way it is, whatever the reason for there being the way the world is part of that, is the reason for that. And the accumulation of that, those perspectives and those knowledge is actually how we get closer to what the world is. In other words, although our knowledge of the world is partial, each person has partial knowledge of the world, and different in between different people, and different cultures, all of that is knowledge of the world. It's not your private mental image. Yes, our knowledge is multiple, but the thing about which we have multiple knowledge is the world, and we have access to it. We can know something of it because the reason for there being anything at all inheres in all of it. We therefore can understand something of it, even if it's partial, even if we'll never understand all of it, even if we can only approach and improve our understanding. And because we can access it, we are obligated to it. In other words, we are obligated to making our ideas account for what we encounter. We cannot. This is a very important sentence from a Relationality, that our ideas account for what we encounter. We can't just make things up. You don't just have the inside of your head. You actually have some access, your particular access and perspective on the world. You are connected to the world and to others. Something of the ground of everything is in you and in all of what you encounter. Therefore, you have some access to it. And you can't therefore just make things up. You can't say that all people of XY ethnic group are stupid or lazy, or all people of XY religion are evil or thieves or violent. You just can't make up statements. You can't, as we said last week, say water boils at 50 degrees Celsius, or gravity pulls up, or there is no electromagnetism. You just can't go around making things up. You have an obligation to the world because you do have access to it. It's not just a home screening of your home movie. The reading, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, the reading that we talked about today ended with two more points. One point about Gupta, and one point about Gillian Rose, the great British philosopher who unfortunately died as quite a young woman, leaving a remarkable body of work. I want to quote J. Gupta. "The modern fundamental error," he writes, "is to take one legitimate dimension of it, freedom, and to posit it as a principle for grasping its entire nature. But a complete understanding of what it means to be a modern, self-determining, free individual will require a comprehension of how such self-determination occurs within already standing, historically evolved structures of interaction." Gillian Rose similarly held that, on one hand, our individual critical judgment is the foundation of the moral stance. We are individuals. We do have our individuality, our individual perspective, our individual critical judgment. Yet, she also insisted that such judgment develops through one's traditions and history in openness to the tradition and history of others. Only with a individual critique that is situated in the world can persons and groups work through the differences and conflicts that history has yielded. Yeah, look.
When I understood you correctly, you said that due to our evolutionary setup, we are driven by altruism. But my question is that really the case in reality? Because I thought about, for example, the Milgram experiment. It was an experiment in the 60s or 70s where they measured the willingness of study participants to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience, like harm other people by electroshots or something. And they figured out that the average person is able to harm other people without any conflicts. And there are theories, for example, in social science, like rational choice, and they say that people are driven by utility maximization and not by altruism. Or, for example, Richard Dawkins wrote a book, I just wrote a joke titled as Egoistische Gen, and he said that the will of people and how they're acting is ruled by the genetic program in their genes. So is there a free will, or did questions came in mind, or the question of theodicy, if all people are good, why is there bad things in the world, or why are there wars and so on? Yeah.
Okay, so a few substantial questions. I'm going to start with the last one first, but even before that, I want to hear what your comments are about Lucas's questions. Theodicy, why are there wars? What about Dawkins, Richard Dawkins? What about the selfish gene and all the competition and aggression that we're willing to foist upon each other?
I don't know if I respond directly to what Lucas said, but it made me think about the childhood and early childhood, the text, the excessive separateness, for example, examples like Gaspar Hauser, or even the Romanian orphanages that were discovered after the fall of the wall, where children were left in excessive separateness. I mean, for just concrete and excessive separateness, and how they cannot develop. There's no development possible if there's no communication, relation, and a taken over of the tribe, so to speak. So I can completely vouch for what you say. Also, the evil, the sense of evil has a lot to do with, again, we go to Freud and also to Jung, but with the theory of attachment, and how I think there are two different things, is the willingness to obey an authority, which has a lot to do with education. And attachment theory research has really shown that children are even born with an altruistic and empathic effect towards the group, and it can be only taken away by education. Actually, it's not given by education. And what is if the child encounters too much grievance to his or her integrity, then it will lose empathy.
And so this was the beginning of studying, as we talked about, attachment theory in the post-war period. And the discovery for the last 60 years that interaction is the way the brain develops, it's the way the neurochemicals of the brain develop, and it is the way emotion, knowledge, our ability to think, develops through interactions. And absent, as you said, babies are wired, they come into the world expecting playmates in the form of mommy and daddy and siblings and all, grandma, grandpa, the village, who's ever around. They come into the world expecting interaction. They come in expecting their cries and their giggles to be responded to, and if they're not, then the built-in, or the wiring that would develop into a healthy person in the sense of sort of psychological development, or what we're calling the separate person but with relation, that development would be blocked, and severe problems.
For example, me too, I don't know, I went to university, I got all the love I could have when I was a child. Still, I'm not sure I am going to make the right decision or to choose the good thing between. I still have to think about it to make my mind up. So, I don't know, it's pretty open, I think. I don't know if I could explain what
There's no question that older children, that children and adults actually make decisions. I think the question here is sort of what are the decisions that people tend to make? Do you, for example, do you interpret the world as a hostile place? Do you see what people are doing as potentially taking something away from you, as hostile, as attacking? And then do you respond with either anger or manipulation or control mechanisms to protect yourself? Is that your tendency? Not yours. Somebody's. Is that one's tendency? Is it your tendency to think that the world is more or less a safe place? You have to negotiate it, you have to be intelligent, but it's more or less a safe place, which means that you can rely on people, trust people, be generous to people. People have tendencies, depending on early childhood, in both ways. And cultures have tendencies, sometimes because of cultural trauma, war, invasion, tsunamis, or etc. You know, these all things affect us.
How big is the difference between parents and children? So the scientist said that the difference is so small we cannot measure it. So that means that this tendency is a kind of heritage from your childhood and your parents.
If a child is abused or abandoned, and we're going to turn to some texts, they will lose some capacities for sympathy and empathy to either a small or larger extent. That will affect the decisions they make, their interpretations of what happens to them later in life. And it will affect their parenting of their children. So their children will be parented by parents who have, let's say, a fearful or suspicious tendency in life, and therefore, as you can see, the cycle can be perpetuated. On the other hand, I don't want to depress everybody, because people make decisions, actually, to deal with themselves, so to speak, and to change their outlook. They do it for because they're having trouble with relationships, or they're having trouble with their work, or they do it in therapy, or they do it because of things they've read, or they don't like the kind of person that they are. They do it for spiritual reasons. We do have the capacity to deal with ourselves. So it's not a 100% bleak picture, but also people cannot deal with themselves. So remember, here's Bowlby. Remember I said he was sent to see what was going wrong in the Romanian hospitals that you mentioned. In Bowlby's attachment theory, even the fetus expects, due to its evolutionary need for parental attachment, that it would be born into a good enough nurturing family. If the child is disappointed and is instead neglected or worse, abused, an all-important area we call the paralimbic cortex, made up of the medial portion of the prefrontal cortex, will be left relatively malfunctional. As a consequence, the child, and others like it who have suffered adverse childhood events, or ACEs, may become handicapped to some extent, leading downstream to their overrepresentation in cohorts of chronically ill patients that are high utilizers of medical care, prisoners in the criminal justice system, and students failing in schools. Narvaez, Darcia Narvaez, joins a chorus of scientists who realize that we need a Manhattan Project devoted to reducing adverse childhood events. In addition to the needs vertebrates have to attach to food and sexual objects, when mammals evolved, our survival strategy changed to also include the requirement to socially attach to conspecifics in the form of parental and social attachments. And as it turns out, so birds picked this up later, mammals came to it first, that we are wired to attach to well, to other mammals, to the human beings in our surroundings. And our brain and our neurotransmitters and our prefrontal cortexes and limbic systems and so on develop through this interaction.